The unexpected challenge. The Galactic Federation had never seen anything like it. The finest military officers from every corner of the galaxy were chosen to test their skills in survival training. These officers were experienced, battle-hardened, and believed that no challenge could truly stand in their way. But there was one thing they had never considered: the arrival of the Deathworlder cadets. The Federation had organized the training on a remote planet, one that seemed inhospitable enough to challenge the mightiest soldiers. It was a place where the environment itself could kill you. The air was thick with toxins, the plants were carnivorous, and wild beasts prowled the dense jungles, ready to tear apart anything that moved. But none of this fazed the Federation officers. They were prepared for the worst, armed with the best technology and weapons available. They believed that nothing, not even the mysterious Deathworlders, could defeat their superior tactics. At first, the Federation leaders had only seen the Deathworlders as a curiosity, a species from a planet so hostile that only the strongest could survive. There had been whispers among the officers about how terrifying these creatures were, how they were born into constant danger, surrounded by death at every turn. They lived on a world where every creature, every plant, was a predator, and only the toughest could make it through the day. These cadets were young, but they had already survived what most could never imagine. But the Federation officers were confident. They laughed when they saw the Deathworlder cadets, smaller, younger, and seemingly underprepared compared to their well-equipped, highly trained ranks. How could these cadets, with their primitive tools and their bare hands, possibly survive the harsh conditions of the Federation's training course? The first day of the survival challenge began with what seemed like a simple exercise: getting from one side of the jungle to the other. The Federation officers were confident they would finish in half the time. With their advanced equipment, their highly developed skills, and their experience in countless dangerous environments, they thought they had the advantage. They stood tall, ready to prove their superiority. But what they didn't know was that the Deathworlders had something far more dangerous than advanced technology: survival instincts. The cadets, though outnumbered, had been living on a death world for their entire lives. For them, this environment was not a challenge. It was just another day. They moved quietly through the jungle, their senses alert to every sound, every movement. They didn't need advanced weapons or gadgets to survive. They had learned from birth to read the land, to understand the rhythms of the wild, and to use everything around them as a weapon or shield. The Federation officers, on the other hand, relied heavily on their gadgets and their technology. They expected to easily navigate the terrain with their advanced equipment, but things quickly went wrong. As soon as the exercise began, the officers found themselves disoriented. The jungle was not just thick with plants, it was full of life, dangerous, fast-moving, deadly life. Their high-tech communication devices began to malfunction. They were unable to get a signal. Their sensors, which were supposed to track the cadets' movements, began to beep erratically. The jungle seemed to be alive in a way that made it impossible for the officers to predict what would happen next. The cadets, however, had no trouble. They moved with purpose, evading the dangers of the jungle as though they had grown up with them. While the Federation officers struggled to adjust to the environment, the Deathworlders calmly set up traps, using the very plants and creatures they were taught to avoid to their advantage. The officers found themselves stepping into pits, getting tangled in vines, and encountering wild beasts that they weren't prepared for. The cadets had already anticipated every danger, and they moved with terrifying precision. As the officers trudged through the thick jungle, growing more exhausted and frustrated, they began to realize that the Deathworlders weren't just surviving. They were thriving. They couldn't understand it. How were these cadets, who should have been weaker, outsmarting them at every turn? The officers' training had always emphasized strength, technology, and tactics, but they had forgotten one important thing. The Deathworlders didn't need all of that. They needed only their instincts, their adaptability, and the will to survive. The Federation officers, with all their advanced equipment, were struggling to keep up. They had become increasingly irritable, questioning their strategies and their confidence. What should have been a simple exercise was turning into a nightmare. They had thought the Deathworlders were nothing more than a curiosity, but now they were starting to understand how wrong they had been. This was no longer a simple test of survival. It was a fight for dominance. And the Deathworlders were winning. As the sun began to set, the Federation officers were scattered and confused. They had lost track of their objective, and the once predictable environment now seemed hostile and alien to them. Meanwhile, the Deathworlder cadets had completed the course, and their only concern was how they would deal with the next challenge. They had become experts at surviving in the most extreme conditions, and this was nothing new to them. The Federation officers now realized they had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated the Deathworlders, believing their technology and experience would be enough to overcome anything. But the jungle and the survival instincts of the Deathworlders had proven otherwise. The officers couldn't help but wonder, if the cadets were this effective in these conditions, what could they achieve if truly pushed to their limits? The Federation's pride and confidence were shattered in that moment, and they were forced to face the reality of the situation. The Deathworlders had outsmarted them, and there was nothing they could do to change it. The survival training had become a brutal lesson in humility, and the Federation officers were left to ponder just how dangerous humanity and its allies truly were. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. The Deathworlders were not done yet. The real challenge had only just begun. The tables turned. The jungle seemed to close in around them as the Federation officers trudged forward, their confidence shattered. Every step felt heavier, and the weight of their own humiliation began to sink in. What had started as a simple survival exercise had become a nightmare they were not prepared for. Their once sure footing had turned into a crawl, and their technology, once a symbol of invincibility, now seemed almost useless. For the Deathworlder cadets, it was a different story. While the officers were struggling to adapt to the unfamiliar environment, the cadets moved effortlessly through the dense underbrush. They were like shadows, blending with their surroundings as they maneuvered with a quiet, deadly grace. The challenges that the Federation officers had faced were merely another day in the life of the Deathworlders. The officers' communication devices had failed long ago. Without their high-tech gadgets, they had to rely on old-fashioned survival instincts. But that wasn't enough. The jungle was unlike anything they had encountered before. It wasn't just the wild animals that posed a threat. It was the very landscape itself. The plants were unpredictable, with vines that seemed to reach out like fingers, pulling them off the beaten path. The ground was soft and treacherous, and every step could lead to a pitfall or worse. They were exhausted, disoriented, and increasingly afraid. Meanwhile, the cadets seemed unfazed by the threats that plagued the officers. They had been trained from birth to navigate deathworlds, environments where every creature was a predator, and every day was a fight for survival. They moved quickly, using their knowledge of the land to avoid danger and find food. They were living, breathing weapons in a hostile environment, and they thrived. The Federation officers began to realize that they were outclassed. It wasn't just the jungle that had caught them off guard. It was the raw survival instinct of the Deathworlders. They were quick to adapt, learning from their mistakes and using every bit of their surroundings to their advantage. The officers, despite all their training, could only stumble in the face of a challenge that was designed to test not just their strength, but their ability to think on their feet. And the Deathworlders were doing just that, thinking and acting faster than their opponents. The officers' frustration grew with every passing hour. They had expected to be in control, but now they were the ones struggling. They had thought of the Deathworlders as weak, primitive beings who lacked the sophistication and training of their Federation counterparts. But the tables had turned, and it was the officers who were now out of their depth. But the real shock came when they realized the Deathworlder cadets weren't just surviving. They were teaching them. In the heat of the moment, in the most dangerous parts of the jungle, the cadets demonstrated techniques the officers had never considered. A well-timed trap, a quick retreat, or a clever use of the environment. Each time the officers faced an obstacle, the cadets had an answer. And it wasn't just about defeating the threats around them. It was about understanding the land on a level that the Federation officers couldn't even begin to comprehend. At one point, a Federation officer named Varric found himself tangled in a mass of thick vines, his blaster useless in the snare. Panic set in as he struggled, knowing that the deadly predators in the jungle would smell his fear. But before he could react further, a Deathworlder cadet appeared from nowhere. The cadet moved quickly, slicing through the vines with a sharp blade made from the very plants that threatened to kill them. Without a word, the cadet pulled Varric to his feet, silently urging him to move. Varric stared in disbelief. He had expected the cadet to leave him to his fate, or at the very least, offer some mockery. But the cadet had saved him, not because it was necessary for their survival, but because it was instinct. This wasn't just about completing the challenge. The cadets were showing the officers that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about using your mind and adapting quickly. It was about understanding the balance of life and death in ways that couldn't be taught in any Federation academy. The officers began to feel a deep sense of shame. They had underestimated these young cadets, belittled them because of their youth, their simple weapons, and their lack of high-tech gear. But now, the reality was setting in. The Deathworlders weren't just surviving. They were thriving in a way that was beyond their understanding. The officers, even with all their years of training and technological advantages, couldn't keep up. They were simply outmatched by the cadets' superior survival instincts. The rest of the Federation officers began to notice this trend as well. Slowly, they started to realize the extent of their mistake. While they focused on tactics, firepower, and precision, the cadets had been raised to think differently. They had been taught to trust their surroundings, to know when to fight and when to run, to use their environment as both ally and enemy. It wasn't about strength, it was about adaptability. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the jungle, the officers knew they had a long night ahead. They were far from the finish line, and they were no closer to outsmarting the Deathworlder cadets. They were beginning to accept that the challenge wasn't just about completing a course. It was about learning to survive in a way they had never been taught. With each passing minute, the officers were learning a painful lesson. The Deathworlders were not just participants in the challenge. They were its teachers. And the lesson they were imparting was one that could never be found in any Federation manual. The cadets' lesson. The jungle was quiet now, the eerie sounds of distant predators fading as the cadets and officers moved deeper into the heart of the wilderness. The moonlight broke through the thick canopy, casting a silver glow over the landscape. It was a beautiful sight, but it held an underlying menace that the officers were now acutely aware of. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, seemed like an omen of danger. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not for a second. At the front of the group, the Deathworlder cadets moved with purpose, scanning their surroundings constantly, their eyes sharp and their senses heightened. It was as if they were part of the jungle itself. The officers, by contrast, were clumsy, constantly checking their readouts and equipment, trying to map their position or find a way to get their communication devices working again. But all the technology in the galaxy couldn't help them now. The jungle was far more dangerous than their gadgets could account for, and it was becoming clearer with each passing moment that the cadets were far more capable of navigating this hostile environment. One of the officers, a veteran named Rylith, had always prided himself on his adaptability. He had survived countless battles on countless worlds, facing challenges that would have broken lesser men. But this jungle, this test, was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The overwhelming sense of helplessness gnawed at him. He was used to controlling his environment, to knowing what was coming next. But here, everything was unpredictable, and his reliance on his training and technology was proving to be a weakness. Rylith watched as a young cadet named Zuri led the way ahead, her movements almost fluid, her senses attuned to everything around her. It was almost as if she could feel the pulse of the jungle, and her instincts were guiding her with terrifying accuracy. She stopped suddenly, raising a hand to signal the others to halt. Without a word, she crouched, studying the ground, her fingers brushing against the earth. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. Zeri's eyes glinted in the moonlight as she looked back at the group. "Footprints," she said softly, pointing to the ground. The officers leaned in, trying to see what she was talking about. To their surprise, there were faint tracks, unlike anything they had seen before, leading off into the dense underbrush. "Predator?" Rylith asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Zeri shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No, a creature of the jungle. It's still nearby." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, and Rylith couldn't help but feel a twinge of fear. He had fought predators on countless worlds, but this wasn't a battle he could win with a blaster or his usual tactics. The jungle wasn't a battlefield. It was a living organism, and it demanded respect. Before Rylith could react, Zeri was already moving forward, following the trail with effortless precision. The cadets knew when to move and when to remain still, an instinct bred into them from a young age. The officers, on the other hand, felt the weight of their own hesitation. They were used to commanding forces, not sneaking through hostile terrain like predators themselves. As they moved deeper into the jungle, it became evident that the officers were learning a new way of survival, one that did not rely on their weapons, technology, or previous experiences. They had to become one with the land, just like the cadets, and they had to let go of their pride, realizing that survival was about more than brute force. The cadets continued to lead the way, showing the officers how to read the signs of the jungle. The sound of distant winds rustling the leaves, the shift in temperature that indicated a predator's approach, and the subtle clues hidden in the landscape that could be the difference between life and death. Rylith, still fighting his own pride, decided to try following Zeri's lead. He slowed down his pace, focusing on the minute details around him. His training had taught him to focus on the bigger picture, but this was different. Survival here wasn't about making grand plans or using his blaster to fight his way out. It was about adapting, being patient, and trusting his instincts. For the first time in his life, he realized that his strength alone wouldn't carry him through this. As the hours passed, Rylith and the other officers began to trust the cadets more. They watched how Zeri and the others adapted to each situation, whether it was using local flora for food or constructing makeshift shelters. The cadets were not just surviving. They were thriving. They had a deep understanding of the land, an intimate knowledge of how to navigate extreme environments without needing external tools. At one point, Rylith and a few of the officers found themselves in a tight spot. A dense fog rolled in, obscuring their vision and making the jungle feel even more oppressive. It was the perfect opportunity for predators to strike, and the officers were caught off guard. In that moment, it wasn't their technology or combat training that saved them. It was the cadets' instincts. Zeri noticed the change in the air before anyone else did. She quickly signaled for the officers to stay low and silent. They crouched down, waiting, as a large shadow passed overhead, moving through the fog. The predator was close. Zeri led them to a nearby tree, its branches strong enough to support them. She motioned for the officers to climb. For the first time, Rylith realized that survival wasn't about standing and fighting. It was about being patient and waiting for the right moment. The predator passed by, unaware of the group hidden in the tree. When the danger had passed, the officers climbed down, their hearts racing. They had survived, but it was because they had learned to trust the cadets' instincts and their willingness to listen. The Deathworlder cadets had shown them a different way to survive, and in doing so, they had turned the tables. The officers were beginning to understand. To survive here, they couldn't just rely on their technology. They had to learn the ways of the Deathworlders. They had to become one with the land, and only then would they be truly prepared to face the challenges ahead. The turning point. The atmosphere in the jungle had shifted, a tension thick in the air that even the seasoned officers couldn't shake off. What had started as a simple training exercise was quickly turning into a humbling experience. The Deathworlder cadets had proven themselves time and time again, navigating through the dangerous terrain with the grace and skill of seasoned survivalists. Meanwhile, the officers, despite their advanced training and technology, were struggling to keep up. It was clear now. The cadets weren't just skilled. They were experts in a way the officers could never understand, rooted in the unforgiving nature of their homeworlds. The group continued their trek, with Zuri at the helm once again. She moved through the dense foliage with such ease that it almost seemed like she was part of the jungle itself, a creature in sync with its rhythms. The officers followed reluctantly, trying to replicate her movements, but every misstep felt like a glaring mistake. They had learned that in this jungle, one mistake could be the difference between life and death. Rylith, now deep in thought, was beginning to understand just how deeply different the cadets were from him. His mind, once laser-focused on combat tactics and weapons, was now opening to new possibilities. The officers' technology could not save them here. Their experience with blasters, starships, and high-tech gear was irrelevant. This place demanded more than that. It demanded instinct, patience, and a deep understanding of the world around them. The cadets had an innate connection to the land, and for the first time, Rylith felt a growing sense of awe and respect for their training. He had underestimated them. Worse yet, he had underestimated the importance of the environment itself. The next trial was even more dangerous. The air began to thicken, and a strange humming noise filled the air. The cadets froze, their expressions hardening. Zuri, who had been leading them confidently, suddenly turned to face the officers. Her eyes, though young, were filled with an intensity Rylith had never seen before. "This is it," she said, her voice low and serious. "The next part of the test. You have to be ready for anything." The officers had no time to question her words. In an instant, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Rylith's heart skipped a beat as the thick foliage around them seemed to come alive. A low growl rumbled through the jungle, and out of the shadows, a massive creature emerged. It was unlike anything they had seen before, tall, muscular, with scales that shimmered like dark steel under the dim light. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, predatory hunger. The officers instinctively reached for their weapons, but Zuri stopped them with a firm hand. She pointed towards the creature, her voice unwavering. "No weapons. You're going to have to think your way out of this. We're not here to fight. We're here to survive." The officers exchanged glances, a mixture of disbelief and unease flashing across their faces. They had trained for combat their entire careers. Confronting enemies head-on was their specialty. But here, in the jungle, with no blasters, no ship to retreat to, Zuri was right. They had no choice but to adapt. Rylith looked back at the creature. It had massive claws and a jaw full of razor-sharp teeth. His mind raced, trying to devise a plan. But in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't a battle of strength. The creature wasn't an enemy they could overpower. It was a test of their ability to survive. "Stay calm," Zuri instructed. "We move as one." She didn't hesitate. She darted to the side, moving like a shadow through the underbrush. The other cadets followed suit, all silently slipping into position. They weren't running. They were outsmarting the predator, becoming one with the environment. They blended with the jungle, hiding in plain sight, their every move purposeful. Rylith could hardly believe his eyes. The cadets didn't just avoid detection. They made the creature seem as if it wasn't even there. The officers, on the other hand, remained frozen in place, unsure of what to do. They watched as the creature paced slowly, its massive form moving like a natural part of the jungle, unaware of the cadets' presence. It was a test of patience, a test of adaptability. Rylith watched as the cadets effortlessly camouflaged themselves. They knew the jungle's every sound, every smell. They could move without making a sound, without alerting the predator to their presence. And it worked. The creature, after what felt like an eternity, lost interest and moved away, slinking back into the shadows from which it came. For a moment, there was complete silence. The air felt thick with tension, but the cadets had succeeded. They had outsmarted the predator, without ever drawing a weapon. And for the first time, Rylith truly understood what Zeri had meant when she said, "We're not here to fight. We're here to survive." As the jungle calmed down, the officers looked at each other, still in disbelief. They had just survived the most dangerous challenge of their lives, not through force, but through the survival skills they had so arrogantly overlooked. They had learned the hard way that in the wilds of a death world, only one thing mattered: survival. Rylith glanced at Zari, who gave him a quiet nod, as though saying, "Now you understand." The officers didn't speak. There was no need for words. They were learning, and they were finally starting to see things through the eyes of the cadets. The challenge was not over, but Rylith now knew that the greatest lesson wasn't in what they could do with weapons, but in what they could do with nothing but their instincts. And the truth hit him like a thunderclap. This was the real training. The humbling test. As the jungle seemed to return to its eerie stillness, the officers stood there, processing what had just happened. It was clear that they had underestimated the Deathworlder cadets. What had been a test for survival had turned into a lesson in adaptability, in the art of blending with the environment, and in thinking beyond the reach of weaponry. The officers, trained to rely on high-tech gear and advanced weaponry, were beginning to see the cracks in their methods. The survival techniques of the cadets were something they could never replicate, and that realization was beginning to sting. Rylith looked down at his boots, his mind replaying the moments with the creature. He had never before found himself in a situation where brute strength and firepower weren't the solution. His hands were still resting on his blaster, but the weapon felt almost unnecessary now. He looked around the jungle, at the cadets who had outwitted the beast without ever lifting a finger to fight. Zeri's calm demeanor never wavered. She stood at the front, her eyes scanning the dense trees around them, looking for the next challenge. She knew that they weren't out of danger yet. In fact, the hardest part of the training was just beginning. "The worst is yet to come," she said, her voice steady, but with a slight edge to it. Rylith's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I thought we were done with that creature." Zeri turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "The jungle is full of things far worse than that beast. You've learned how to survive one threat, but there are many others. The next test will test your true resilience." The officers exchanged nervous glances. They had made it through the first part of the test, but it hadn't been easy. They had barely kept their cool as the creature prowled in the underbrush. Now they were about to face something far worse. Zeri continued, her voice lowering. "You've learned one thing already. Survival isn't about strength or weapons. It's about using your mind and understanding the environment. Now, we'll put that to the test." Before anyone could ask any more questions, the sound of a loud snap echoed through the jungle. Zeri's eyes narrowed, and she motioned for everyone to be silent. They moved quickly, slipping into a line as they ventured deeper into the forest, with Zari at the lead. There was a sharp edge to her movements now, a predator-like precision. The cadets had seen this before. This was the final phase of the training, where the jungle itself would test their ability to survive. They didn't have to walk far before they found their next challenge. A loud crashing sound broke through the quiet, and the officers instinctively reached for their weapons. But Zeri immediately stopped them with a sharp hand gesture. "No weapons," she reminded them. "Remember what I said. Survival is about adaptability." From behind the trees, a creature appeared, a massive, multi-limbed beast that resembled a blend of a reptile and an insect. It had dark, chitinous armor covering its body, and its eyes glowed an eerie yellow. It was nearly as tall as a building, its legs moving in unison as it emerged from the underbrush. The air seemed to vibrate with the creature's presence, and the officers instinctively took a step back. Rylith felt his heart race. The creature was far more terrifying than the previous one, and it was fast. He knew that fighting it would be impossible, but he still couldn't shake the urge to draw his blaster. He glanced at Zari, who was already giving orders. "We're not fighting it," she said calmly. "We're going to use its instincts against it." The officers looked confused. Use the creature's instincts against it. How was that possible? Rylith opened his mouth to protest, but Zari raised her hand, silencing him. "Follow my lead. Do exactly as I do." Without further explanation, she dropped to the ground and rolled into the underbrush. The other cadets followed suit, seamlessly blending into their surroundings. Rylith watched as the cadets disappeared into the dense jungle, leaving the officers standing still, unsure of what to do next. The creature moved closer, its massive legs crushing the leaves beneath it. It scanned the area with sharp predatory eyes, searching for prey. But it couldn't detect the cadets, who had already disappeared from sight. Rylith held his breath, trying to stay as still as possible. He could feel the sweat beginning to trickle down his back as the creature drew nearer. Zari's voice echoed softly from the shadows. "Now, wait." The officers stood completely still, not daring to make a sound. It felt like an eternity as the massive creature walked closer. Rylith could feel the tension mounting, the oppressive weight of the situation closing in on them. Then, in a flash of movement, the cadets sprang into action. They moved quickly, silently, each cadet working in perfect synchrony. The creature, distracted by the sudden movement, turned its massive head. But it was too late. Zari and the others had already triggered a series of traps they had set in the ground earlier. The creature was caught in a tangled net of vines, which constricted around its limbs, immobilizing it completely. The officers stared in stunned silence. The creature that had seemed so terrifying just moments ago was now completely neutralized, not by brute force, but by the very environment they had once thought to be their enemy. Zari stood up from her hiding spot, wiping dirt from her hands. "That's how you survive in the wilds of a death world. You don't fight head-on. You use the environment, your surroundings, and your wits." Rylith was speechless. He had learned a valuable lesson that day, one he would never forget. The most powerful weapon wasn't a blaster or a fleet of ships. It was the ability to adapt, to think ahead, and to use the world around you to your advantage. For the first time in his life, Rylith truly understood what it meant to survive. And more importantly, he understood the depths of the Deathworlder cadet skills. They weren't just surviving in this jungle, they were thriving. The officers finally understood. In this jungle, weapons meant nothing. Survival was a game of mind, and the cadets had just proven it. With a deep breath, Rylith looked around. The real test was only just beginning. The final test of survival. As the massive creature lay trapped in the net, the jungle returned to its usual hum. The officers, still stunned by the display of skill, looked around in disbelief. They had seen the Deathworlder cadets face danger head-on without hesitation, without fear. They had outwitted creatures that even the most seasoned officers would have struggled to survive against. But the jungle was never satisfied. It would not let them rest. There was always another challenge waiting around the corner. Zari turned to face the officers, her expression now serious, almost intense. She knew this was the moment they would either rise to the challenge or fall short. This was the last phase, the final test. "Get ready," she said in a calm, steady voice. "This isn't over. You've learned how to survive the wilds of a death world, but now you'll have to survive it with your minds, your instincts, and your will. This is the true test." The officers exchanged nervous glances, but this time they didn't hesitate. They were ready, or at least they thought they were. They had made it this far, hadn't they? They had faced the unknown, the terrifying creatures, and they had come out on top. But the look in Zari's eyes told them this next test would be unlike anything they had encountered before. "We'll split into teams," Zeri instructed. "The objective is simple. Get to the extraction point before sundown. You'll have no weapons, no technology, and no help. Just the environment and your survival skills. This will test your ability to think, to adapt, and to trust one another." Rylith felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just a test of physical survival anymore. It was a test of everything they had learned. Their ability to work together, their ability to think on their feet, and above all, their ability to survive without relying on the tools they had always depended on. Zeri divided the group into pairs. Rylith was with another officer, Lyris. The two of them had never worked together before, and Rylith wasn't sure if it was the best combination, but there was no time to argue. The sun was already beginning to dip behind the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows over the jungle floor. "Move quickly," Zori warned. "You're on the clock." Without further instruction, the group dispersed, moving as silently as they could through the jungle. The officers, who had once been so confident in their ability to conquer any situation, now found themselves struggling to keep up. They were no longer in control. The jungle had taken that away from them. It was as though the very trees and the air around them had become an enemy, watching, waiting. Rylith and Lyris moved together through the thick undergrowth, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The sweat was pouring down Rylith's face now, the humidity of the jungle making it harder to breathe. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, but he didn't stop. Every step felt more important than the last. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made him flinch, as though the jungle itself was about to turn on them. "What's the plan?" Lyris asked, her voice tense. "We move fast," Rylith replied. "We follow the Cadets' lead. We have to keep our heads down and stay focused. We don't stop unless we absolutely have to." They pressed on, moving with increasing urgency. They had no idea what awaited them, but they could feel the clock ticking. The sun was setting fast, and the jungle's dangers only grew stronger as night approached. Shadows seemed to move in the corner of Rylith's vision, and every rustling leaf set his heart racing. Suddenly, there was a loud growl, followed by a massive roar that shook the trees. Rylith froze. The sound came from somewhere to their right, deep in the jungle. His hand instinctively reached for his blaster, but then he remembered. No weapons. He glanced at Lyris, who had her eyes wide with fear. "That's the sound of a predator," Rylith muttered under his breath. "And it's coming closer." Without thinking, he grabbed Lyris's arm and pulled her behind a thick tree trunk, urging her to stay as quiet as possible. They both crouched low, trying to steady their breathing. The growl grew louder, closer. It was the same creature they had seen earlier, the massive, multi-limbed predator that had nearly killed them all. But now it was hunting again. Rylith's heart hammered in his chest. The air around them felt thick, suffocating. They had to make a decision, and fast. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They had no choice but to move. "Follow me," Rylith whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. He glanced around, looking for an escape route. The creature was close. He could hear its massive legs snapping through the underbrush. But there was something different about this predator. It wasn't just a mindless hunter. It was intelligent, calculating. It would find them if they didn't act fast. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his eye. It was Zeri. She was ahead of them, crouching low to the ground. Without a sound, she moved into position, signaling for Rylith and Lyris to follow her. She was using the jungle itself to her advantage, disappearing into the foliage. Rylith didn't hesitate. He motioned for Lyris to stay close, and the two of them followed Zeri through the dense underbrush, the predator still hot on their trail. The jungle was alive with sounds now, the roar of the creature mixing with the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the distant call of other unknown beasts. Rylith's mind was racing. They couldn't let the predator catch up to them. They couldn't let the jungle claim them as its next victims. They ran faster, following Zeri's lead. Every step felt like it could be their last, but they pushed on. This was their final test, their final chance to prove themselves. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting the jungle into darkness, the officers finally saw it, the extraction point just ahead. They were close, but they still had one final challenge to face, getting past the creature that had been hunting them. With one last push, Rylith and the others reached the edge of the jungle, just as the creature emerged from the shadows. But this time, they weren't going to run. They had learned something from the Cadets. They had learned to survive. Now they had to outsmart the predator and finish the test. Zeri stepped forward, her eyes locking with Rylith's. She gave him a quiet nod, as if to say, "It's time." The final test was about to begin. The final showdown. The extraction point was within sight, a clearing that had been marked with bright lights and a transport ship hovering in the distance. But the officers and cadets knew that the true test wasn't just about making it to safety. It was about facing the creature that had been stalking them for the past hours. The massive, multi-limbed predator emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Its powerful limbs rippled with muscle, and its sharp claws scraped against the ground as it moved with terrifying precision. The officers had nowhere to run. There was no more room for mistakes. This was their final challenge. Rylith stood beside Zari, heart pounding. He could feel the tension in the air. The jungle, which had been their constant companion and adversary, now seemed eerily silent, as if holding its breath. "Do you know what's coming next?" Zeri whispered, her eyes narrowed, studying the predator. Rylith nodded grimly. "I think it's learned everything it needs to know about us. It's going to be smarter now, more dangerous." Zeri's expression hardened. "Then we'll have to be smarter than it." The officers, though shaken, seemed to come to the same realization. This wasn't just about brute strength. It was about survival, outsmarting the predator in its own territory. "Listen closely," Zeri continued, her voice steady. "We've trained for this. Every step we've taken up until now, every challenge we've faced, has led us to this moment. The jungle is full of threats, but we've learned to use those threats to our advantage." Rylith could see the others nodding, their fear beginning to transform into determination. The predator may have been terrifying, but they were not going to let it defeat them. The creature hissed, its claws scraping against the ground, ready to pounce. It was only a few meters away now, and the officers tensed. But Zeri had a plan. She motioned for them to spread out, positioning them in a loose circle, with Rylith and Lyris on opposite sides of the creature. "Now," Zeri shouted. The officers moved quickly, using the environment to their advantage. They ran in different directions, kicking up dirt and leaves to confuse the predator. It was quick, but the officers had learned to be quicker. They ducked into the shadows, using the terrain to break its line of sight. The predator let out an enraged roar, its glowing eyes scanning the area. But it wasn't used to being hunted. It was used to being the hunter. Rylith, moving silently, managed to get behind the creature. His breath was shallow, his mind racing. He knew what needed to be done. He had to distract it long enough for the others to get into position. With a quick motion, he tossed a rock into a cluster of bushes on the opposite side. The creature turned toward the sound, its massive head swiveling sharply. That was all the distraction Rylith needed. "Lyris, now!" he shouted. Lyris, hiding in the shadows, launched a series of bright flares into the air, their sudden light causing the predator to recoil. Its eyes momentarily blinded, it hesitated, giving Rylith and the others the opening they needed. Zari, who had been circling behind, moved in swiftly, closing the gap. She threw a net at the creature, designed to entangle it. The predator roared in fury, thrashing against the restraints, but it was too late. The officers worked together, pulling the net tight, using their combined strength to keep the creature from breaking free. Rylith's heart was pounding in his chest as the creature struggled, its claws slashing through the air. But the officers held firm, showing a level of unity and teamwork they hadn't demonstrated before. They had learned from the Deathworlder cadets. They were now part of something bigger than themselves, part of a force that would never back down. The creature's resistance began to slow, and it finally fell still. The officers stood around it, panting, each of them covered in sweat and dirt. But they had done it. They had survived. Zeri stepped forward, her expression calm but satisfied. "Well done," she said simply. "You've proven yourselves." The officers exchanged looks of exhaustion and relief, knowing that they had not only survived the jungle but had conquered it. They had learned to think, to adapt, to trust one another. They had faced a predator more terrifying than any they had encountered, and they had outsmarted it. The Deathworlder cadets had shown them the way, but it was their own strength that had carried them through. As the transport ship descended to pick them up, Rylith stood tall, feeling the surge of pride. They had faced death, and they had emerged victorious. The galaxy may have underestimated humanity, but now they would know. Humans were not to be taken lightly. The Deathworlders had taught them how to survive in the harshest environments. But now, they had taught the galaxy a lesson. Never underestimate a human warrior. The universe would never forget the fury of humanity.